Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you improve your chess game. Today I thought we'd do an overview of the Open Sicilian. And I thought I'd start by talking about the London system. The London system is very popular today, much more popular than it ever was. And the reason it's popular is a lot of people started playing online when the pandemic hit, or they started playing online when they watched the Queen's Gambit. And they're not, really into studying openings or trying to learn a lot about, how to play the opening part of the game. So they just want to play white and just kind of not fall into any traps and get their pieces out. So they've been told to play the London system because it's hard to get into trouble in the London system in the first half a dozen moves. You just play a bunch of moves like, d4, bishop f4, knight f3, e3, maybe bishop to e2 and h3 and c3 and knight bd2 and castle kingside, and kind of ignore what your opponent is doing and, try to play some chess, which is perfectly fine. And that's, good way to play chess if that's the kind of chess player you are. But if you want to be a serious player, you're going to have to learn something about openings. I always say you don't have to sit there and memorize opening books or lock yourself in the closet. That's silly. But on the other hand, you want to learn something. You want to learn the main tabias of the openings that you play. And you want to look up your games after each game in a database or a book or an engine and ask, if I had to play this game again and I had a chance to improve on a move, which move would I improve on? What would I do? You want to do that after each game. Well, some openings, unlike the London, are very tricky. For instance, the advanced French, e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, is fairly tricky for white. So I tell people, try to avoid playing the exchange variation of the French if you're white, if you want to learn something, because it's a little bit too much of avoiding imbalances. And avoid the advanced variation unless you want to learn it. If you want to learn it, that's great. The advanced variation is a good opening for white. But it's easy to get into trouble if you don't know it. Same thing with the knight to g5 variation of the two knights defense. It's a lot of fun, and you should play it and have some fun. Grandmasters on the fourth move of the two knights defense play d3. But knight g5 is a fun move, and of course, if your opponent plays it all wrong and falls into traps, you can play things like the fried liver or the lolly. But knight g5 is a fun line to learn, but it's tricky, and if you're black, you should definitely play the gioco piano, bishop c5 on the third move instead of knight f6. So there's certain openings that are tricky, and one of the trickiest openings in chess is what's called the Open Sicilian. So I thought in this video we'd do a quick overview of the Open Sicilian. The Open Sicilian, they've written more opening books about than like almost everything else put together. So there's no way I'm going to go into any detail. I'm just going to overview about what the Open Sicilian is. And I'm going to start at the end right here. One of the reasons I wasn't showing you what I was just talking about was I wanted to keep this position on the board for a few more seconds because I'm going to kind of end here. I'm going to start at the end and work my way back. One of the questions is, when someone plays the main line of the dragon and white plays the main Yugoslav attack, what line for white is the best line? And when I was growing up, bishop c4 became the main line. Some people played h4, some people played castles. And then the engine started saying that maybe on the ninth move, white should play g4. So I thought I would give the position to Stockfish 13 and let him think for like an hour, just for the fun of it, and see what he thought was the best move here. And at first, for the first few minutes, he thought that g4 was the best move. But as he got into deeper play and he looked deeper, he's now changed it to castle queenside, which of course is one of the main lines. And what's also interesting is look how good white is in this position. White is ahead by 0.58. 0.58 is about 3 times a normal opening advantage that you want to allow. If you were black and white played e4, and you want to say, I came out of the opening okay, you'd want the advantage to be about a third of this, maybe 0.2 or less. So here, 0.58, that's a pretty big number. All right, we've had our fun. Let's go back and start where we're going to start. We're going to make the board bigger. Let's go back to the start of the game. What is an Open Sicilian? An Open Sicilian is where white plays knight f3 on the second move, and when black does something like knight c6 or d6 or e6, white plays d4, black takes the pawn, and white takes back with a knight. That's called the Open Sicilian. And the Open Sicilian has many, many, many lines in it. And if you want to play the white side of the Open Sicilian, you have to be willing to start to learn those lines and start to look them up in opening books or videos or databases or engines, something like that. Because this is the kind of position that if you don't know what you're doing, black can get a pretty good game pretty quickly. So I thought we'd give it an overview. And before we finish the overview of different lines in the Open Sicilian, let's mention what's not an Open Sicilian. What's not an Open Sicilian is when you don't play knight f3 and d4. For instance, if you play knight f3 and then you play bishop b5 check, that's called the Moscow variation. If you play knight c3 and black does something and you play g3, that's called the closed Sicilian. Interestingly, the closed Sicilian is not the opposite of the Open Sicilian. The opposite of the Open Sicilian is called an Anti-Sicilian, and a closed Sicilian is one of the Anti-Sicilians, just to make things a little confusing. All right, white can also play f4 here. That's called the Grand Prix attack. That's another Anti-Sicilian. Still another Anti-Sicilian is the c3 Sicilian, or some people call it the Lappin Sicilian. c3 Sicilian is an Anti-Sicilian. If black plays knight c6 and you play bishop b5, that's called the Rossolimo variation. White could play a gambit like d4, c takes d4, c3, which is the Mora gambit. Or white could play b4 with a more rare wing gambit like that. Let's see here. White could, in some lines in the Sicilian, he could, for instance, play d4 and take with the queen. That's kind of an Anti-Sicilian. And here, if black attacks the queen, then you pin it with the bishop, and you probably give up the bishop pair so you don't have to move the queen, and probably play your pawn to c4, setting up a Maroczy bind kind of position. But that's another thing. But we're going to spend most of the video looking at the lines where you play e4, c5, knight f3, and now black's going to play something, and then you're going to play d4, and he's going to take. All right, so let's start with the knight c6 lines. All right, so knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight d4. What could black play here? Well, black could play an immediate d6, but that's actually a bad move order. I had people play that against me when I was a low-rated player. What white should do here probably is set up a Maroczy bind kind of situation by playing c4. That's probably the best way to play against this bad move order. So what does black normally do instead? Well, he could play e5. That's the rare pelican variation. White usually plays knight to b5, trying to go after this square. If black first attacks the e-pawn and white guards it, and then black plays e5, well, that's the much, much more popular Sveshnikov variation, which Kramnik and a lot of other top grandmasters made very popular. And again, white's best move is to play knight on 4 to b5. If he plays pretty much any other move, black can play bishop b4, threatening knight takes e4, and also threatening d5. For instance, if white guards the pawn with the bishop, then black can play a move like d5, and black has at least full equality already. That's why white pretty much has to play knight on 4 and b5, and that's why I said what I said at the start of the video, which is if you don't know what you're doing, and you're just winging it, and you say, all right, I'll just bring my knight back, already black's got equality. You know, you don't want to let black do that in openings. You don't want to give him such an easy way to equalize or even get a better position. So you want to know what you're doing. What else could black play here? Well, he could play e6, and that usually transposes into the e6 openings. Where white has a choice, white can play knight c3, and then maybe a6, which would be a Taimanov. A Taimanov. There's different ways of saying Taimanovs versus Paulsons, but that he could do. Also, after knight f6, knight c3, he could play d6, which transposes into one of the d6 lines, where you could reach this position two different ways. You could play e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d, knight takes d, knight f6, knight c3, knight c6, or you could play e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, d6, and get to the exact same position. All right, when you get to this position, when the Batsford people, the British authors, started writing about this in the early 1970s, they dubbed this the classical Sicilian. And what happens in classical Sicilians? Well, we can see right now, I'm letting Stockfish run. I'll move it up so you can see it too. Stockfish says the best move against that is to play Bishop G5. Bishop G5 against the classical Sicilian is known as the Richter-Reuser variation. But that's not the only line you could play. Let's have Stockfish show you like the top three here. All right, so we got D6, top three moves. We've got Bishop G5, and then we have the modern line F3, which the idea is to play Bishop E3 and play it like an English attack. An English attack is very popular against the Najdorf, which we'll look at a little later. But F3 is not a way that people thought of playing against this classical line in old days, but now people do play that. And the third move in the top three is the Sozin variation, Bishop C4, which is also the way Bobby Fischer liked to play it. He liked to get that bishop into the attack, Bishop to C4. So to go back, let's make the board bigger again. After E4, C5, Knight F3, Knight C6, D4, C takes D, Knight takes D, Knight F6, Knight C3. The two most popular moves are D6, allowing the classical Sicilian, or being the classical, allowing Richter-Reuser or Sozin. If White plays Bishop E2 and E5, that's a Boleslavsky. White could play the modern F3 followed by Bishop E3 with an English attack. Or Black can play the Sveshnikov, where you play Knight on 4 to B5. Got to look this up. There's a whole ton of book moves here. Or Black could even play something like E6. This is called the Sicilian Four Knights. And I used to play this line. It's a little bit of a tricky line too, and a lot of people got confused when I would play this and think I was in something else. And they would play moves that weren't very good here, like Bishop to G5. In fact, if I show you what the computer's thinking here, the computer's thinking that White should play maybe even Queen to D3. This is a move that no one ever played against me, I don't think even in speed games. So you can see it's pretty rare to try, this Sicilian Four Knights line is a line where White's going to have to play a little bit differently than he normally plays. Okay, so let's make the board bigger again. All right. So let's go back and let's take a look at some more lines. Let's take a look at E4, C5, Knight F3, E6 lines. All right, we already transposed into a couple of those. For instance, after D4, C takes D4, Knight takes D4, Knight F6, Knight C3, Knight C6, we've got that Sicilian Four Knights again. If Black plays Knight C6 and White plays Knight C3, and Black plays something like A6 with the idea of Queen C7, that's again the Taimanov variation. On the other hand, if Black doesn't put the knight on C6, and he puts the pawn on A6, and he intends to delay putting the knight on C6, this is the Khan variation. Usually Black plays an immediate Queen C7, and against the Khan, White usually doesn't play Knight C3. He usually plays something like Bishop D3, or he could even set up a Maroczy bind with C4. And in fact, if we show the top two moves for Stockfish against the Khan, you can see right now it is, well, it just changed, but it was C4 and Bishop D3. So the Grandmasters had it right all along, if Stockfish is correct, that those are the two most accurate moves against the Khan. But again, those are moves that you wouldn't think of if you're White. A lot of my students play against these openings, and they always play Knight C3 no matter what Black plays. Well, that's not a terrible move, but it's not one of the top couple moves to play. So you have to be careful if you're playing Open Sicilians just to always stick your knight on C3. Usually you put your knight on C3 if Black attacks your e-pawn, because if Black attacks the e-pawn here, White pretty much has to guard the e-pawn because he can't play e5. Do you see why? If you don't, maybe you can pause the video and try to figure out why e5 is bad. Well, the answer is that Black simply plays Queen A5 check, double attacking the king and the E5 pawn, and no matter how White gets out of check, he's going to lose that pawn. I actually once fell into that trap back in when I had been playing for a year or two. And I was very embarrassed because I knew the trap. I knew that e5 couldn't be played. And for some reason I zoned out and I forgot and I played e5 anyway. And I lost the pawn and I was lucky to get a draw. So yeah, you can't play e5. So if he plays knight f6 in a lot of these lines, you usually have to play knight c3. Not every line, but in a lot of the lines. Okay, so let's make the board bigger again. Alright, so if you play e4, they play c5, you play knight f3. We just looked at the lines with e6, d4, c takes d, knight takes d. Again, if black does nothing here and plays like d6, you can always set up this Maroczy bind. Setting up this c4, e4 against the Sicilian, if black lets you do it, is often very strong. So he's not going to just play these bad move orders and let you do that. Okay, there's the rare pin variation. Knight here, bishop here. And this is a very interesting variation, which is very complicated. If we look at the top moves, e5 is played, and now black has a choice of knight d5 or knight e4. Usually he plays knight d5, and in the old days we looked at things like queen to g4 here, which Stockfish likes. And Stockfish still likes queen g4, which is interesting because bishop d2 is also good for white. Let's take a look at knight e4. Knight e4, Stockfish, now bishop d2 is not so good for white. Now he says you should definitely play queen here. If the knight takes the pawn, queen takes g7, rook f8. And now the right move for white is to play a3. So if the knight makes a discovery, you can take off the bishop. And if black plays bishop to a4, you could play bishop d2 when the knight can't move and guard the bishop. But Stockfish says even more winning is bishop h6. All right, so that's the pin variation. Pin variation, very rare for black. But if you're white, you want to know what to do. All right, let's take a look at the d6 lines. Those are the most popular. Knight f3. Oh, let's look at a6 for a second first. Knight f3, a6. This is called the O'Kelly. The O'Kelly is the only Open Sicilian where it's not really an Open Sicilian. Why? Because here white shouldn't play d4. Believe it or not, this innocuous looking move a6 allows black to play early e5s, like with knight f6 and then e5. For instance, d4, pawn takes, knight takes. Black can play something like knight f6, knight c3, e5, with pretty much close to equality. So the O'Kelly is the only regular Sicilian for black where d4 is not the best move. If you look at the underneath where I have Stockfish shown here, the top two moves for white, well, they were c3 and c4, playing like a c3 Sicilian or setting up a Maroczy bind. And now it's also saying you could play g3, which is not something that I have seen good players play against the O'Kelly. But here, playing c3 or c4 as if you're playing an anti-Sicilian is actually the right way to play against a6, rather than go into an Open Sicilian. So this is the only second move for black where that's kind of really true. Now, obviously, black could play, rare lines. He could play, instead of a6, he could play knight f6. And now you can't, play d4 because you're losing a pawn. And now you're in a whole different opening. I think this is called the Nimzovich Sicilian. So knight f6 kind of takes you out of the Open Sicilian. All right, so back to the main lines. d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4. Black usually plays knight f6 to force the white knight to guard the pawn and go in front of the c-pawn so you can't set up a Maroczy bind. And now black has a whole bunch of moves. We already have seen the classical Sicilian. If you play e6, I think my friends in Europe have told me to pronounce this the Scheveningen variation. I used to call it the Scheveningen, but they said, no, Dan. It's the Scheveningen. So the Scheveningen variation, and the main line against that, and again, you have to kind of learn these tabias, is to play g4, a move that you probably wouldn't even think of if you weren't studying the openings. But this is called the Carrez attack after one of my chess heroes, Paul Carrez. And Paul Carrez came up with this idea to play g4, and I think the computer thinks that's the best move, and that's the move that scared all the Grandmasters off of this Scheveningen variation. All right, what's the most popular move here? The most popular move, the one that you see with Grandmasters playing today, if they need to play for a win, is the Najdorf, named after Miguel Najdorf, the Argentinian Grandmaster who originally came from Poland but stayed in Argentina as a refuge in World War II. And Najdorf came up with this idea of keeping those knights out of b5 when black wants to play e5, but he doesn't want the knights to go to b5 and attack that back d pawn. So he came up with this idea, a6, the Najdorf variation, and then it became extremely popular, and world champions played it. Bobby Fischer, it was his main defense against e4. Garry Kasparov, ditto, and still popular today, although the computers have made the Sicilians, more something that the top grandmasters are avoiding a little bit, because with all the complications and with white having an aggressive position, it's easy to find ideas for white to keep the advantage with the engines. So that therefore e4 c5 has become less popular lately, and e4 e5 is the more common defense that you see in top grandmaster tournaments for e4. But if you're in the final round of a match and you need a win, well, then you still see grandmasters going for imbalances and they play c5. And here the Najdorf is the main line. What are some of the main lines inside the Najdorf? The bishop g5 was the main line when I was growing up. Fischer liked to play bishop c4. I think the computers don't like that much anymore. It's not that popular. What is popular is the English attack with f3 and then bishop e3. You could play bishop e3 first and allow this kind of chase variation, which was popular back in the 90s. Bishop here, and now white either plays bishop e2 or h3. But if you don't want the chase variation, if black doesn't want the chase variation, he could just play e5 and play bishop e7 and allow f3. And if white doesn't want the chase variation, then white could play f3 first. And if black plays e5, knight b3, bishop e7, play bishop e3, and we're back on the English attack again. Okay, so e4, c5. Let's conclude this by looking at the various dragons. Let's start with the hyper-accelerated dragon. The hyper-accelerated dragon is g6, where you play g6 right away on the second move. Here, white doesn't even have to play an Open Sicilian. If we bring back our engine, you can see that d4 is not the main move against the hyper-accelerated dragon. Just like against the O'Kelly, it likes c3 and c4, and it even throws in that g3 idea. If you do play d4, oh, sorry, I didn't even turn on the engine, no wonder it likes the same lines as the O'Kelly. It was still showing the O'Kelly lines. I take that back. All right, so let's correct the video. After g6, the top three moves by still includes c3 and c4, so that part was correct. But yes, d4, the Open Sicilian, is the second best move here. It likes setting up the Maroczy bind right away with c4 as the best move. If you do play d4 and he takes, you could actually take with the queen here. But Stockfish thinks, even though taking with the queen attacks the rook, and he can't play bishop g7, Stockfish still thinks it's a little bit more accurate to take with a knight and just let him transpose into one of the other lines. Okay, so that's the hyper-accelerated dragon. Let me turn that off so we don't make the same mistake. All right, so in hyper-accelerated dragon, white can play d4, Open Sicilian, or he could play like c4, trying to set up a later d4, Maroczy bind. Okay, how about knight c3? Then d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, g6 again. This is called the accelerated dragon. But notice, because black has not attacked the e-pawn with the knight, you can again set up the famous Maroczy bind. And the Maroczy bind against the accelerated dragon is the single most famous Maroczy bind. Probably the only other really famous one is against the hedgehog, which is a little outside the scope of this video. But setting up the Maroczy bind against the accelerated dragon, where the hedgehog is the main line. A lot of people here for white, instead of setting up the Maroczy bind, they do play that kind of normal knight c3, and then after bishop g7, they play bishop e3, knight here, and now playing those Yugoslav kind of ideas with f3 is wrong, because black can play d5 in one move. So therefore, white very often in these kind of positions plays a move like bishop c4 to stop d5, and if black castles, let's see what Stockfish wants to play here. I think knight b3 is a common move, bishop b3, not knight b3, sorry, bishop b3. Right, bishop b3 trying to stop d5, but black could still play d5 anyway and temporarily sacrifice a pawn with an interesting line. You can see Stockfish has white better by about 4/10 of a pawn, which is more than an opening advantage, but no more than a normal Sicilian advantage. In Sicilians, very often, white gets an advantage greater than the 0.2 we talked about way back in the London system kind of stuff. All right, what does that leave us with? It leaves us with the main line of the dragon, which is d6 and not c6. Not knight c6. d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6. This is called the dragon because these black pawns here look like a little dragon on the king side. The most popular move is bishop e3, and now knight g4 is a bad move. Bishop checks, and all of a sudden black's got problems. If he puts a knight on c6, there's two pieces attacking and only one defending. If he puts the bishop on d7, sneaky pin, thank you for the knight, queen takes g4. So black can't play knight to g4, he just plays bishop g7. But now he's getting ready to play knight g4, so white does play f3. Black castles, white plays queen d2, black plays knight c6. And now we have all those famous lines, bishop c4, castle, h4, g4. And we started the video with this position, and I had let Stockfish think for an hour, and Stockfish said, well, g4 was my move for the first few minutes, but after that it switched and said the old castle queen side with about a 0.5, if I remember, was 0.55 advantage. 0.58 it was. 0.58 advantage for white, which is a pretty good advantage, 0.58. And of course the dragon is not the most popular among the top grandmasters. They don't want to give up 0.58 in the opening. That's too much, because it only takes about 1.0 before you might be losing, and 0.58 is a long ways toward 1.0 from 0. So if white's normal advantage is 0.2 and a 1.0 is close to winning, then 0.58 is roughly half the way between a normal white advantage and white being on the borderline of winning. So that's a pretty big advantage to give someone out of the opening, and that's why the dragon isn't as popular. Okay, so we've talked about, tricky openings today, like two knights defense, the advanced variation of the French. But the main point of today's video was to overview the Open Sicilian. We didn't go into very many lines, just a few common things that you can get into. But if you're going to play the white side of this, it's a really, really good opening for white. As you can see from the numbers that Stockfish is generating, advantages of 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, 0.6. That's a lot better than a normal white opening usually. But you have to learn the lines. Each time you learn a line against one of these lines in the Sicilian, it's a tabia. You don't have to lock yourself in a closet and learn an entire opening book. That's way too much. But you do have to learn, like, at least the most popular, how to play against the most popular lines, which let's say there's 6 to 8 of those. That's learning 6 to 8 tabias for white. And if each tabia takes 20 minutes, well, then you got to learn those 6 to 8 of them, which might take you like 3 hours to learn how to play against Open Sicilians. And then you still want to look them up after each game. If you don't like looking up your openings after each game, I highly recommend you don't play the Open Sicilian for white if you're an e4 player. Okay, that's about it for today's video. If you liked the video, you could like it, you can subscribe, but the best thing you can do is tell your friends about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess, here on YouTube. We've got about 186 videos and counting, and we'll see you next time. Bye.